All right. I was very honored to be invited to speak at this conference, but I was also perplexed because I don't really know much about the world of sci-fi and fantasy. So I talked with Mr. Daniel and we came up with a plan. I'm going to tell you about a famous author and how some of his not so virtuous decisions affected his writing and indeed his whole life. And if you are the first person to message the moderator, Cindy Collins Smith, and tell her the name of this author, I will mail you a shiny new quarter. But what you're here to talk about is fantasy and sci-fi. So after my talk, my son, Father Steve Mathewes, is going to say a bit along that line. Then I'll wrap up with some thoughts about bees, and we'll open the floor for Q&A. My talk is about a well-known 19th century author whose works were noted for depiction of virtues like loyalty and courage and self-sacrifice and a warm domestic family life. In his prime, he practiced what he preached. He had a wife and 10 children. His best friend was the writer John Forster, and he was a steadying influence on this intense and lively author. Forster would tell him when he complained about his wife that he himself was a difficult person to live with, volatile and testy, and he would urge him to remain faithful and loving. Yes, John Forster was our author's great good friend. But then he made a new friend. And here we must pause to ponder St. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15:33. Bad company ruins good morals. This new friend was the novelist Wilkie Collins. You would know Collins as the author of The Moonstone and The Woman in White. Collins was much younger than our author, and we may say, full of the Dickens. Wilkie Collins was not much encumbered by Victorian morality. He was an odd-looking figure with a petite body and a large head like a light bulb. But as he increased in wealth and fame, his personal attractions became irrelevant. He established 2 homes in London with 2 mistresses and their children. In his novels, he often portrays marriage as a bad thing, and he avoided it all his life. Once our author took up with Wilkie Collins, he had less use for his old friend, John Forster. Collins took him to the bawdy houses of Paris, where previously unimaginable fun was going on. Coming home again to his stout wife and expanding brood began to feel intolerable. And the name of this famous author is... Charles Dickens had been growing more irritated with his wife, Catherine, for some time. Catherine was never a match for his energy, and as the number of children increased, she became increasingly passive and withdrawn. Nobody said postpartum depression back then. And then Dylan met, gotta edit that. And then Dickens met a young actress, Ellen Ternan. She was barely 18 and Dickens was 45. 2 of his children were older than she was. Nellie was delicate and fairy-like, and Dickens was hooked. Then he sent Nellie a bracelet with a loving note. But the package was accidentally delivered to his house, and Catherine opened it. This resulted in a permanent rupture. Catherine departed from the family home, and Dickens retained custody of the children as British law provided. Only their eldest, Charlie Jr., went with her. After that, Dickens forbade the children to have any contact with their mother. When the daughters were grown, he insisted that they not invite her to their weddings. When her 4-year-old son died, he didn't tell her. He never saw her again. Gossip arose, so he began telling people that Catherine was not a good mother, that she didn't love the children, and that she had long begged him to let her leave the family home. He even asked a doctor to certify her as insane so he could have her institutionalized. But Catherine remained loyal to him to the end. On her deathbed, she gave a parcel of old love letters to her daughter, saying, that the world may know that he loved me once. Charles Dickens cleaved unto Nellie Ternan for the rest of his life, but that was only about a dozen years. There are signs those years may not have been happy ones. At the end, he fell into a kind of desperation, driving himself beyond his physical limits, to die at 58. But that comes later in the story. How did this series of non-virtuous decisions influence Dickens' writing? From the beginning, Charles Dickens was a shooting star. He rose to fame while still in his 20s as the beloved author of The Pickwick Papers. He was cheerful, gregarious, animated, and a man of boundless energy. He commonly walked 12 miles a day, sometimes 20 or 30. He said, "If I could not walk far and fast, I think I should just explode and perish." Dickens was extremely prolific. While editing magazines and putting on amateur theatricals, he wrote A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, and many more. Surprisingly, for someone who thrived on praise, he was not jealous of other writers. On the contrary, he was generous and encouraging, giving them prime space in his magazines. He called himself the inimitable, and I think he believed it. He had no fear of competition because he knew that he was one of a kind. Now let's take a look at the novels Dickens wrote after he took up with Nellie. There are only 3. The first is A Tale of Two Cities, a magnificent novel of the French Revolution. But I doubt anyone would call A Tale of Two Cities their favorite Dickens novel. It lacks the brightness and humor of his previous works. It is solemn and occasionally horrifying. Something else typical of Dickens is missing from A Tale of Two Cities, something that had become almost a signature item. A lovely and innocent young girl, characters like Dora in David Copperfield and Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop appear on the page like untouched lilies. After Nellie joins Charles's life, they're gone. Instead, we have depictions of women who reject a man's love. In A Tale of Two Cities, 3 men court Lucy Manette, and she rejects 2, not unreasonably. But in Dickens' subsequent novel, Great Expectations, rejection is laced with cruelty. It's one of the most memorable scenes in all of Dickens. A poor boy named Pip has come to the grand manor house to be a playmate for little Estella. Pip is led through the decaying mansion to meet elderly Miss Havisham. She's wearing an old and tattered wedding dress. While she was dressing for her wedding, decades ago, she received a note from her fiancé breaking the engagement. And Miss Havisham has locked her whole life to that moment. The clocks were stopped, and no detail in the house has ever changed. In the center of the dining table, Pip sees a huge, rotten mound. It is Miss Havisham's wedding cake. If you've never read any Dickens, I hope that will hook you. Many people call Great Expectations their favorite Dickens novel. What's relevant to my purpose today, though, is that Miss Havisham hates the male sex, and she is raising beautiful Estella to hate men, too. She has brought Pip in specifically to see Estella break his heart. Pip's heart is broken almost immediately. He can't get over how beautiful she is. But Estella treats him with contempt, demeaning and insulting him. In earlier Dickens novels, you would expect to find an innocent, trusting young woman. This Estella is a tantalizing fiend. And note how her name echoes Ellen. Dickens' last complete novel is Our Mutual Friend. The rejecting female appears here, as in Great Expectations, but now there are also flaws in the writing itself. Dickens is no longer at the top of his game. And now I have to give you a spoiler. So if you plan to read Our Mutual Friend, put your fingers in your ears. The lead female character, Bella, resents her family's poverty, and she's determined to climb out of her class. She knows that a wealthy man, aware of her greedy, selfish nature, has written his will so that his son John can receive his vast inheritance only if he marries her. Bella believes that John was drowned at sea, and she complains about losing all that money that should have been hers. But John has actually become an assistant to her kindly adoptive father, Mr. Boffin, to study her character before revealing himself. In time, the two of them fall in love, but how can John be sure that she's overcome her fixation on money? And this is where things go wrong. Dear Mr. Boffin begins to act strangely, becoming ever more miserly and selfish. These scenes are hard reading because Dickens has previously made Boffin such an adorable character. It looks like he's having a mental breakdown, and that's heartbreaking. Well, it turns out it was all an act, and Bella passed the test, and now she gets to enjoy both John and money. But when all these pieces are fitted together, they still don't fit very well. All of that stagecraft, just to test Bella? Isn't there an element of cruelty here? Isn't the whole idea kind of clumsy? There's much to love in Our Mutual Friend, but just note that in Dickens' last novel, the story is about finding out whether a young woman is only as interested in a man's money. You can unplug your ears now. And another thing, in Dickens' novels, there's often a cherubic male character. In Our Mutual Friend, there are two. There's often a disabled character. In Our Mutual Friend, there are two. There's often a noble daughter who is taking care of her father as if he were her child. In Our Mutual Friend, there are three. I began to wonder if Dickens had some stalled projects on hand and was just cramming bits of them into the story. And another thing. Dickens had a gift for complex plots with a satisfying denouement. In Our Mutual Friend, the subtlety is gone. The bad guy is entirely bad, with no good side. At the end, someone dumps him in a garbage cart. His fate seems less like justice and more like vindictiveness. There's a subplot in Our Mutual Friend that may be relevant. It hints at some private suffering. There's a good working girl named Lizzie who catches the eye of a dour and rigid schoolteacher named Bradley Headstone. Perhaps Dickens' celebrated talent for character names was also running dry. Headstone has an overwhelming desire for Lizzie, and as they walk in a churchyard, he spills his heart to her. I'm going to ask my son Stephen to help read what Headstone says to Lizzie.
You are the ruin of me. I have no resources in myself. I have no confidence in myself. I have no government of myself when you are near me or in my thoughts, and you are always in my thoughts now. You are the ruin of me. I have no resources in myself. I have no confidence in myself. I have no government of myself when you are near me or in my thoughts, and you are always in my thoughts now. You draw me to you. If I were shut up in a strong prison, you would draw me out. I should break through the wall to come to you. If I were lying on a sick bed, you would draw me up, to stagger to your feet and fall there.
The wild energy of the man, now quite let loose, was absolutely terrible. He stopped and laid his hand upon a piece of the coping of the burial ground enclosure, as if he would have dislodged the stone.
No man knows till the time comes what depths are within him. To some men it never comes. Let them rest and be thankful. To me, you brought it. On me you forced it. And the bottom of this raging sea has heaved up ever since.
At this point, Lizzie says, "I've heard enough. Let's stop here." But Headstone begs her to walk once more around the churchyard. He said no more until they had regained the spot. There he again stood still and again grasped the stone. In saying what he said then, he never looked at her, but looked at the stone and wrenched at it.
You could draw me to fire. You could draw me to water. You could draw me to the gallows. You could draw me to any death. You could draw me to anything I have most avoided. And you could draw me to any exposure or disgrace. This is what I mean by your being the ruin of me.
He brought his clenched hand down upon the stone with a force that laid the knuckles raw and bleeding. What a powerful passage. What powerful writing. And it's all about thwarted desire. Perhaps Dickens had spoken such words himself. A great author may well feel desire for a delicate teenaged beauty, but why would a teenaged beauty desire a moody, restless, middle-aged man? In a photo taken soon after they met, Dickens is balding, with two great muffins of hair extending over his ears. There are deep creases in his face, and he looks weary and sad. Lastly, I'll mention the first chapter of Our Mutual Friend, which is one of the darkest things I've ever read. It starts with its sunset on the Thames, and we see two figures in a rowboat. You can tell they're father and daughter. But for some reason, it's the daughter who's doing the rowing. She's at the oars, while her father sits in the stern looking around. You can't figure out what's going on, but over the course of 4.5 pages, a horrified realization grows. When I first read it, I thought, where the heck did that come from? Perhaps Charles Dickens was having some darker thoughts those days. Sometime after meeting Nellie, he joined the London Ghost Club, and John Forster said he had something of a hankering after ghosts. He attended seances and was intrigued by the supernatural. I believe there can be great danger in exploring such things. They can open a door in your mind through which images and ideas may come, whether you want them or not. It's hard, maybe impossible, to get them out again. Wilkie Collins had some troubles himself along that line in his later years. He said he was sometimes accompanied by a double, which he called Ghost Wilkie. When he climbed the stairs at night, he said ghosts would gather and try to push him down. And sometimes, when he got to the top, he was met by a green woman with tusks. In 1865, death began its march toward Charles Dickens. On June 9th, 1865, a train carrying Dickens and Nellie suddenly plunged off a bridge. Cars crashed down into the river, and Dickens' compartment was left hanging at an angle. He was instantly out and among the injured and dying, helping however he could. Then he remembered he'd left behind the manuscript for Our Mutual Friend, and he climbed back into the dangling train car to get it. Dickens was gallant at the time of the crash, but the screaming, the mangled bodies, the spectacle of death marked him deeply. For 2 weeks he couldn't speak. Travel by any means became terrifying. Years later he wrote, "To this hour I have sudden vague rushes of terror, which are perfectly unreasonable but quite insurmountable." 5 years later, to the day, he would die. Dickens forced himself to resume train travel, even though he was terrified. He was used to having command over his body and compelling it to do as it was told, but he could not stop himself from shaking. In 1867, Dickens came to America for a speaking tour. 76 readings in 5 months, varying between Boston to Washington, Niagara Falls, and everything in between. He called his appearances a reading, but it was more like a one-man show. Dickens originally wanted to be an actor, and he acted out his best scenes from memory, declaiming, laughing, or shouting as necessary. But he was becoming dangerously exhausted. He limped along on a swollen foot. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and was mired in a miserable cold. His doctor had warned him that his heart was not beating properly. But he would not give up the stage. In 1868, Dickens took ship to return home and spent the journey planning a speaking tour of the British Isles. He also added a significant burden to the demands of these readings. He decided to perform the scene in Oliver Twist when cruel Bill Sikes bludgeons to death the prostitute Nancy. As usual, he would play both parts. Dickens began rehearsing it in the back garden of his home, greatly alarming his son Charlie, who dashed from the house to stop a bully from murdering his wife. Dickens asked his son what he thought of the scene, and Charlie replied, "The finest thing I've ever heard, but don't do it." It was superlatively good writing and terrific theater, but he knew it would kill his father. Dickens launched into the new series of readings, doing one every other day, traveling throughout Scotland, Ireland, and England. The murder scene was a sensation, and women screamed and fainted in the audience. But it took a heavy toll. Dickens was dizzy now and unsteady on his feet. The performance left him nauseous, even the next day. His digestive symptoms now included hemorrhage. His left leg and arm felt weak. He couldn't raise his arms above his head. He couldn't touch something without first looking at it closely. Out on a walk with his old friend John Forster, Dickens mentioned that he could only see the right hand of shop signs. He was on the brink of paralysis or stroke. Dickens gave 74 readings in 6 months, but was at last persuaded to cancel the remaining events. While he rested, he planned a dozen more readings, all to be in London. At least then there would be no more train travel. In 1870, Dickens dove into the last 12 readings. He was clearly broken. He could no longer say the name of his first book, Pickwick, and looked surprised when Pick-Snick and Peckwicks came out instead. At intermission, his pulse was up to 124. Before a performance, he whispered to a friend, "I shall tear myself to pieces." At last, Dickens agreed to stop the readings. But that doesn't mean he rested. He made the rounds of banquets and theaters, meeting dozens of his era's celebrities, even putting on a play with friends. By day, he was working on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his last unfinished novel. On June 4th, 1870, his daughter Kate visited him, and she was troubled by his dwelling on the past. He told her that he wished he'd been a better father, a better man. He looked, she said, as though his life was over and there were nothing left. On June 8th, 1870, Dickens sat at the dinner table, clearly in pain, with tears in his eyes. Then he suddenly rose and said he needed to go to London immediately. He fell to the floor and never resumed consciousness. He died the next day, June 9th, 1870, the 5th anniversary of the Staplehurst rail crash. Why did Dickens drive himself so hard? He had always been an exuberant person, bursting with energy. When his body started failing, he simply commanded it to do as it was told. That had always worked before. But his body was becoming too weak to obey his demands. He was truly tearing himself to pieces. I think there's another reason, though. For writers, it's very gratifying to be praised for their work, but that praise generally arrives slowly and in small quantities. When Dickens was on stage, he could see his audience, hundreds, even thousands of people who loved him, who were captivated by his performance and showed it in cascading applause. Perhaps that is why he kept doing it, even when he knew he was dying. In his determination to stand before his audience, to know that it loved him, Charles Dickens broke his own heart. As I wrote this talk, I was praying that I would not misrepresent Charles Dickens. What he did to Catherine was heinous, but he was a model of many other virtues that we might not have: courage, perseverance, generosity, and, without a doubt, hard work. But it was sexual temptation that took him down like a whirlpool. The devil found the perfect combination of factors to overwhelm his conscience and defeat it. And here we must pause to ponder St. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 10:12. Let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And let us pray for the repose of the soul of Charles Dickens, whose works have given so much joy and even moral resolve to readers around the world for 150 years. Now I'll turn it over to Father Stephen. Here's your mic, honey.
Honey.
I can call him
Love
honey.
it. Thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be part of this wonderful conference and to be joining my own mother in this little endeavor. I was asked by Career Frederica to join her with her intention that my knowledge of sci-fi and fantasy culture, which obviously is more at the heart of this conference, would cover her ignorance in those areas. I was hoping that my mother would know me a little bit better so that she wouldn't be so tragically mistaken. I do certainly have a love for those things, but I'm just not as well read or well versed in these things that perhaps many of you in the audience are. So really what I wanted to do, being so happy and delighted to be part of this, is and as I've been kind of saying recently, that I'm here to be the Robin to her Batman, which goes to show you my knowledge of sci-fi and fantasy. So that's the one dynamic duo that I can think of. But in the end, it seemed perhaps if there's anything I can offer, perhaps it might be useful to give a few thoughts from a pastoral perspective, building off of her very wonderful talk, where the place that I started from was in considering this tagline, or this kind of theme that's been given for this year's Doxacon: Virtuous Decisions in Fiction. And I mulled that over in my mind for quite a while, kept turning it over. What exactly does that mean? Virtuous decisions in fiction. And it was confounding for a while, but then as I continued to think about it, I realized that the fact that there do appear to be several potential interpretations to this is in fact good, and each of these is worthy of careful consideration. We absolutely need to attend to what we receive into ourselves. And this is critical. Not all media is good to consume. You know, some things simply cannot be, shall we say, part of a balanced breakfast for a growing Orthodox Christian. There are some things that we simply should not imbibe. But in my view, I think most media, the vast majority of media that exists, regardless of its medium, so be it books or film, video games, tabletop games, music, which is my main milieu, anything, whatever the medium is, most of the media that exists likely falls on a very broad and gray spectrum of bearing potential good or potential ill for us, or sometimes both, some mixture of the two. What was underlying the theme for this year's Doxacon, Virtuous Decisions in Fiction, is the wonderful passage from St. Basil the Great, where he speaks in the metaphor of the honeybee and the way in which the bee can go to the flower and extract from it, take from it that which is nutritious and useful to the bee, and leaving behind that which is not needed. And we, of course, can see not only how that metaphor was useful to the readers and the hearers in St. Basil's time, but that it very much is applicable to us in our time. It's a very useful way of understanding how to approach our consumption of media and entertainment. It has just as much application, I believe, in our time. And obviously, this is the belief of the powers that be behind this wonderful conference, too. So we should attend to these words from St. Basil and see how it can inform the way in which we are living. We should be careful about what media we are consuming and the ways in which it is affecting us and what we are drawing from it and what we're leaving behind. There was several years ago that, back when I was a very, very new priest, that someone, and I'm not even sure, I don't recall at least now how they came to contact me, but they emailed me asking for my advice on how they should, basically what kind of music they should listen to. They had questions and personal concerns about what they were listening to, and if it was okay for them to do so. Again, maybe they found from somewhere that I was not only a priest but an audiophile, and that there was a lot of different music that I liked to listen to and still like to listen to. And the main artist that they brought up was Radiohead, the wonderful alternative rock band Radiohead. Should I listen to this music? And at the time, what I effectively wrote back, myself thinking, well, I listen to Radiohead. What's wrong with Radiohead? And I said that should be fine. I wouldn't worry about it if I were you. But then they wrote back to me, and they said, well, I just, when I listen to them, the depression, the moroseness of the lyrics and so on, it kind of weighs on my soul, and I feel like maybe it's not good for me. Are you sure that that's what I should do? Now, again, I regret being younger and more ignorant at the time, because what I should have said to them is, no, if that's how it feels, if that's how you know that you are being affected by this, lay it aside. Lay it aside. We often can find ourselves sensitive to certain aspects of the media around us. Some of us may be especially sensitive to the negativity of words, lyrics, or the content of books or movies. Maybe we're very sensitive to foul language or profanity. Maybe we're very sensitive to violence, to gore, to horror, to sexual content, maybe multiple of these things. But we should not ever be embarrassed about this. We should not ever think that this is a liability of ours. If we are being, if we're feeling the effects of these things upon us, upon our mind, upon our souls, then that's absolutely something that we should attend to. We shouldn't feel as though we shouldn't be so bothered by them, like that's the right way to be. We shouldn't feel pressured into consuming these things that we can tell are affecting us negatively. We should be willing to give them up, to stay away from them, if that's what our own soul is telling us. This kind of sensitivity is nothing to wish away if we have it. Now, one thing a person cannot fail to learn within Orthodoxy is the relationship of all things through our mutual creator, the interconnectedness of all things. We don't exist in isolation from the rest of creation. We affect creation as we interact with it, as we encounter it, and we are affected by it. And this is for good or for ill. This is simply what it means to exist and move about in this world that God has created as part of that creation. I've come across, and perhaps you have as well, a way in which the modern world, or maybe this is an example of the way in which the modern world likes to view our engaging with the world You know, a post-Enlightenment, hyper-rational, setting aside the religious mumbo-jumbo way of understanding that we human beings exist in the world. It's a quote that I'm going to give to you, which I've seen shared on the internet a lot, meme style, kind of shared around. I was not able to find exactly its origins. Best I can tell is maybe it just started simply as a post on Reddit that someone did 5 or 6 years ago. But again, maybe you've seen this before. And it quite simply says, "You don't have a skeleton inside you. You're a brain. You are inside a skeleton. You're piloting a bone mech that's using meat armor." You're inside a skeleton. You're piloting a bone mech that's using meat armor. That is how our modern world thinks that we should view our own experience of reality. That we have that great distance from what we are seeing, what we're observing, what we're encountering, and that we're really just a thinking machine composed of organic material inside this bone mech covered in meat armor. That is the mindset that is constantly being offered to us, impressed upon us by the world, as well as by the media that comes from our culture. And we must be careful not to adopt this kind of mindset. We do not have that safe distance at which we are observing the rest of the world. We are right there with the rest of the world and constantly affected by the rest of the world. So, the question then, if we're here to broadly consider the topic of virtuous decisions in fiction, then the first question, at least for me, is whose virtuous decisions? Whose virtuous decisions are we talking about here? In reading works of fiction or watching works of fiction, movies and television and so on, there are 3 parties as far as I see. 3 parties. There is the author, there is the character, and then there is you, me, the reader, the viewer. And these 3 form, I think we could consider it as like an imperfect trinity of persons. Imperfect because obviously this relationship is always changing and never perfectly aligned. And as one of the 3 in that trinity, we need to be cautious and attentive to how the other 2 persons in this imperfect trinity are engaging with us. So first of all, there's the author. And I don't have much to say on that topic. Very much has been covered already by Korea Frederica's talk highlighting Charles Dickens. The author in their own life will naturally affect what they're creating. And that creation, of course, being an offering to the world. And so I think the only thing that I could say more directly is for any authors in the audience, any one of you who is a creator of some kind of content, that you're authoring things that are being put out into the world for others to consume, flowers for God's precious honeybees to come and taste of, that we should, as authors, be very carefully considering what we're putting in there. And that comes first from how we live our own lives. And that we ourselves are choosing virtue in our lives so that when we come to create our works of fiction and so on, that is imbued with the same virtue that we ourselves are living out every day. So the second person in that imperfect trinity is the character. That fictional figure that's at the center of the work of fiction. And that could be the main character, it could be the villain, it could be any kind of ancillary character. All of these characters, I think collectively, are the second person. And there can be a great difference of what virtue is, let alone who is virtuous or who is not virtuous, but even how virtue is implicitly defined within these various characters, all across the wide array of fiction that is available for us to, again, to read or to watch, to consume, that's been created throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia. There is such a variety of what virtue is supposed to be, how we should understand virtue to be on the very the various heroes and anti-heroes and so on, all the different characters that we have. And I just want to briefly give two contrasting examples. In both of these, just to kind of even the playing field a little bit, I'm taking both of these from film franchises. So on the one hand, let's consider the hero that is portrayed in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of these Marvel superheroes, and again, I speak as a fan. I've seen all of these movies. They can be wonderful movies. These heroes that are at the heart, by and large, we're speaking of them collectively, generally. They are heroes in the sense that they are, of course, superpowered. They have these cosmic powers and abilities. They're supercharged. And generally speaking, they also will share in some type of positive view of humanity, that life deserves to be preserved, life deserves to be defended and upheld, and that people deserve to be, not controlled by any domineering or malevolent authority. That they should be, happy and free and alive, basically. But beyond that, these heroes can kind of slack off on what virtue is exactly. Some of them can exact a lot of gleeful vengeance against their enemies. They can be, lifting the car off of the innocent bystander and then turning around and saying an insulting word to someone else. Sometimes they can be petty. Sometimes they can be less than honest or truthful. Sometimes they can be somewhat sexually driven. And so so what we see as virtue within the collection of Marvel superheroes is pretty gray. It's pretty clouded. If we consider, then moving again to a different film franchise, the heroes at the heart of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we see a very different kind of virtue. These figures, Gandalf and Aragorn and Legolas and so on, these figures are not only mighty in strength and ability, skill, and so on, but they're mighty of heart as well. They display humility. They display a true Christ-like love that comes from self-sacrifice. Think of Aragorn, for instance, not aspiring to the throne of Gondor, but in fact even shying away from it. He's not interested in that kind of power and fame and renown. Or think even, in a small scene, again, from the films, the way in which he wants to spare Éowyn's feelings when she hands him a bowl of nasty soup. This is a true hero, one who can wield the sword mightily in battle and who can be gentle with the heart of a fellow human being. So we need to consider the different ways in which virtue can be portrayed within the characters, the second person of this trinity. And the third, of course, is me, is you, the reader, the consumer of all of this. There are several ways in which virtue plays a role in how we engage with the media, with the fiction that we're consuming. First of all, there's virtue in choosing what to consume. And that can include when we are consuming, when we're doing our reading of fiction or watching movies or television. How late at night is this happening? Is there other stuff that we perhaps should be doing as well? Are we spending the same amount of time with this as we are on our prayer, on our reading of scripture and edifying works? Am I watching this hyper-violent movie or this horror film late Saturday night before liturgy? Is that a way to prepare myself for this important time of prayer and communion with God? And of course, how much as well? And like we said, am I spending more time on this than on virtuous things, on spiritually edifying things? Am I indulging? Am I being gluttonous in this? We can also have virtue in again choosing the quality. And going back to that honeybee metaphor, being careful to recognize within ourselves what truly is going to be beneficial to us, what truly is going to be malicious to us, that we are careful not to ingest unseemly content. And again, there are some things that pretty much across the board are going to be inappropriate for us to consume. But within that spectrum, know yourself and prayerfully ask God for you to know yourself, so that you know whether you are being overly titillated by this, and maybe need to put it away. Maybe you're being too enthralled by the violence that's taking place, or the vengeance that's at hand, or so on. Know yourself and know what is setting you off, and stay away from those flowers. And then finally, there's virtue in as the consumer, as the reader, virtue in our relationship to the character. The way in which they are living, they're acting, they're behaving, and even what is happening to them. How is that affecting us? What reaction are we having? This person may be fictional. It may not be a flesh and blood human being made in the image and likeness of God that we are sinning against. But even if they're a facsimile of humanity, the way in which we engage with that facsimile still shows the true inner workings of our heart. So, for instance, if a character, maybe a dislikable, disagreeable character, gets its comeuppance, and we have this glee about it, the Schadenfreude, such that the work of fiction is intending for us to feel, is that really what should be springing forth from our hearts? Are we going along with the characters in their negative choices, in their selfishness, or their greed, or their lust, or whatever it may be? Are we following along with them in their vicious choices? So what reaction is in our heart to who they are, to what they do, to what happens to them? And again, what does this reveal within our own heart? So to sum all this up, I would simply say nothing is neutral. We certainly have to banish that idea from our head. There is nothing that we consume, whether it be media, whether it be fiction, entertainment content, or anything else in this life. There is nothing that we consume that is neutral. So there is no consuming of media that is without the question of virtue. So we should make these virtuous decisions. And of course, we know the place where we find the guidance for making these virtuous decisions comes within our life, within the church, comes within our moving ever closer to the illuminating light of knowledge, which is the person of Jesus Christ. To quote one of my favorite works of fiction, the video game, The Legend of Zelda, "It's dangerous to go alone, so take this." Thank you very much.
Well said. Thank you, Father Steve. I'm remembering to call my son Father. So I'll wrap up just a few minutes and say something about bees. The mission statement of Doxacon draws on this passage from St. Basil the Great. "Now then, altogether after the manner of bees, must we use these writings," the writings of the great philosophers. "For the bees do not visit all the flowers, but they just select what they need."
I just realized we didn't move the microphone back over.
That's another one. That's a good one. No, probably it does make a difference, so I'm glad. Well, I hope you're having fun editing this on your end.
Make it hard for you. Next, we're going to switch clothes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Father Steve. I really enjoyed that, and I think obviously you know a lot more about things like Legend of Zelda than I do, so you're still way ahead down the road where I can barely see you.
I had the elementary school grades to prove it, too.
That's true. Wow, we go way back to the Atari. I remember that. Anyway, I wanted to wrap up by saying something about bees. The mission statement of Doxacon, as Father Steve was saying, draws on this passage from St. Basil the Great. "Now then, altogether after the manner of bees must we use these writings," meaning the writings of the great philosophers. "For the bees do not visit all the flowers. They just select what they need." St. Basil says, "So we, if wise, shall take from heathen books whatever benefits us and is allied to the truth, and shall pass over the rest. I was a beekeeper for a few years, and somewhere along the line, I heard this quote: "The difference between a bee and a human is a bee will never bring anything into the hive that could damage it." You probably know that in each colony there is one queen bee, a number of male drones, and all the many thousands of other bees are female workers. And they work without ceasing, continually seeking out nectar for the hive. A bee dies when her fragile wings get worn out and can no longer support her. She falls to the ground and cannot raise herself and dies there. A worker bee never stops working, and she dies in flight. A bee can do that. A bee can work continuously without diversions or amusements, but we're not like that. Our minds would break if we didn't give them rest. But as St. Basil says, we must choose carefully. Everything we bring into our homes, into our hives, changes the hive. Everything we allow into our attentive mind, our nous, changes it. Stories that are very exciting make ordinary life seem boring. Actors who are very sexy make ordinary spouses seem boring. Stories that glamorize revenge cultivate self-righteousness and make humility and forgiveness look weak. We can take in messages like that without even noticing it. And what's more, these stories affect everyone in the hive. We're more porous than we suppose. We live in a matrix of spiritual powers, visible and invisible, and our choices have reverberations that we cannot predict. St. Basil urges us to be careful and watchful in our choices. He was talking about the Greek philosophers, but we aren't worried about whether it's safe to read Plato. We're trying to manage the endless parade of entertainment and all forms of media, which is marketed to us in ways that utilize psychological warfare. St. Basil could never have imagined our situation. And if we're honest, we know he would be horrified by some of the things that we enjoy. He stated that the guideline was that we must select only that which is of benefit and allies with the truth. Some of what we consume may not meet that standard. We think it's doing us no harm, but what faculty can we use in that self-evaluation except our own damaged minds? Even if we're making healthier choices, we may still be giving them more time than is healthy. Jim Kushner, the editor of Touchstone magazine, wrote something that hit me really hard. He said, "Does watching hours and hours of well-acted and fascinating TV dramas in some way bring me closer to Christ? Maybe, but maybe not." Picture this alternative. Father Roman Braga was an Orthodox priest who was imprisoned by the Soviet regime in Romania. He spent 4 years in solitary confinement. No books, no human contact, nothing even to look at. And he said, you had to go somewhere. You had to find an inner perspective. And in learning how to go somewhere in prayer, he discovered what he called the inner universe, where he came into the presence of God. All of us have within us that same inner universe. All of us could find the way to constant prayer, as he did. But we would have to accept sometimes the very challenging form of ascesis, known as boredom. If we didn't look at screens, we would get bored. But what would happen next, after being bored? After we stopped feeling restless and resentful, what might we start to notice? How might our nous be healed if we gave it a rest and a healthy diet? Each of us has this inner universe to discover where we may meet Christ and begin to live for the first time. Lastly, I want to say that bees do not attack. They don't go around looking for someone to beat up. No, bees defend. If something disturbs the hive, they instinctively rush out to defend it. Each bee can sting only once, and then she dies. Let us be just as diligent to defend what has been placed in our care, our own souls, and those of the children in our homes. And may we die in flight, working for the good of the hive. Thank you.